This is a little primer on some things to consider when you make an infographic. I'll walk you through one infographic template site at the end, just very briefly. However, there is another video that shows you how to specifically use one source, even though I kind of fumble through it, but you can fumble through it with me. Here we have, if you look at the underline to our how to make an infographic, that is one big infographic, and I would consider that an infographic fail. Even if it uses great graphics and has good information, that is too long to read. If you were to blow that up to human size, some of that text, would probably be legible, but then you'd have to try to read it at your feet, right? Or some of it's going to be too high. So there's no way that this can be shared in any kind of forum unless it's just some scrolling website for how to look at it. So infographic fail. A little overview, we're going to look at things to consider. Importance, size, position, and color, and how you can use those to communicate ideas. Then we'll look at some infographic fails and go over some infographic builders. Here is a very meta infographic about infographics, just because not a lot of people think about the periodic table as being an infographic, but it is. It communicates a lot of information about the elements and how our universe works in this graphic diagram. So the way that those elements are organized and the way that they are colored and grouped into columns all communicates information about those elements. So these are some things that you need to ask yourself as you are making your infographic. What is the issue? Can you sum it up in a single sentence? Maybe it needs 2 sentences, but those sentences should be easy to understand and digest by the average person. And consider what we cover in our science communications lecture for who that average person might be. Once you understand your issue, once you have that defining sentence, you need to think of what is the single most important piece of data that people would need to convince them or to connect them to your issue. So maybe your issue is global climate change or sea level rise, or maybe something more specific. But in that vein, if we go above 2 degrees Celsius in our global climate change, what percent of people are going to be negatively impacted, or what percent of Americans are going to lose their houses, right? So thinking about how do I take my issue and connect it to my audience with great importance. So if you can't narrow it down to just one, which often you can't, right, because you need multiple sources, you want to kind of figure out what your top 3 are. Regardless of the numbers here, just be thinking about the most essential data, the figures, the quantitative figures that people need to understand your topic. And the last one, how do I connect things that are important to me to things that are important to other people? And I have to do this with environmental science all the time. Like, why do I care about the environment and why do I want it saved? That might be something totally different than why other people do. Maybe I want biodiversity on Earth preserved because I think that all those species should exist and they're wonderful, and I don't want to be part of the reason that they're all going extinct, right? Other people might not care that there are so many species, but they might care that the loss of those species will lead to the loss of fresh water, right? If there's a community that relies on access to fresh water, such as an agricultural community, how is that going to impact their ability to produce food? How much money will it cost them to be able to preserve those resources? So we're going to look at a bunch of infographics, and normally I would be in discussion with you. You'd be telling me what the main point was, what you liked about it, what you didn't like. So I'm just going to point some things out. So here we can see an example of connecting climate change to people. Climate change threatens your health. So threatens, right? That's a word. That's going to tell people that climate change has some relationship to their health and it's negative. So we don't want that to happen. And then your health, people's health is very important to them, right? It determines whether you can do your job. It determines whether you're going to continue to live your life. So health is very personal, and threatens is a powerful word. And see here, we are connecting to many different people, no matter where you live. right? But that's kind of a sub point. The first thing that you see in here, because of the contrast in colors and because of the location and because of the language, this is the first thing we see. So this is number one. This is the second, and then we can kind of move downward from there. So we don't have a lot of figures here. We're just being told some information, and that is less convincing. For me, I like to have some figures, and maybe I even want to see some sources of where that came from. Here, this World Health Organization lends it some credibility because we have this global organization of different countries that are working together to provide us the information. For some people, this might be less credible, but that's a very political topic. So here is where we have our figures. Between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause 250,000 additional deaths per year due to malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and heat stress. So that's a pretty scary figure as well. And again, it's highlighted because it has high contrast with the background. It's different than all this other kind of warm-toned color palette. So we have these two very scary points here in the same color palette. And then everything else has very warm tones, right? And so that warmth is connected to our climate global warming. Here again, we see warm tones to communicate warming. And we have our main point up here on the top. 2012 was the second most extreme year on record for the nation. And this would be situated in context of some article that I was reading, right? So record heat across the US, state by state temperatures in 2012. We have a figure here that we can look at. So maybe if we live here in the middle of our country, we are going to be more concerned. Or maybe if we're up here in the Northeast, we are thinking about how warm it's getting and how impacted we are. And then we have 3 pieces of data, right? So it's the warmest year on record for the US for the average temperature. And we see that average temperature is increasing. And then this number is really interesting because it looks almost like 365, which is a whole year, right? So record high temperatures tied or broken. Within the United States, there were 356. A lot of people are probably just going to kind of breeze past that and read it as 365. Approximately 1/3 of the US population experienced 100-degree temperatures for 10 or more days. So we don't know, or the average person, me, doesn't know how out of character that is, out of context of all this other information. So communicating information with very little text is going to take a lot of stuff out of context, right? But we are going to provide that context within the framework of our entire infographic. And your infographic will have more information on it than this one does. So things to consider: size. Larger text communicates importance. It can also communicate an increase or an excess. So thinking about how to communicate particular information by the size of your text or the size of a figure that you use. So here, my eye doesn't jump up to this at first. It goes right to the middle because this is where there's the most high contrast, right? White on this gray to black, and then very large numbers. So it's short and central and huge. So that draws my eye right to it. And then I kind of work my way outward to try to understand what's going on here. So the world needs to leave 62% of fossil fuels in the ground, or the world needs to leave 88% of coal in the ground. So these are 2 pieces of data for what we need to do. And then I'm like, need to do for what? Oh, to have just a break-even 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. We must keep most of the world's fossil fuel reserves in the ground. So this explains the first thing that my eye jumped to, but I had to kind of go out and find it. But that's because they think that these figures, perhaps, are the most important thing to understand. So here, our biggest element is 2 degrees C. And for many people, that's now a familiar number because that is the number that the IPCC gave us for what our sort of irreversible climate change scenario was. If we can stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we get a relatively quick return to potentially more normal conditions, where if we exceed that, especially if we exceed 2 degrees Celsius, then we're in this more positive feedback loop cycle where we don't see a return to normal anytime soon, even if we do cut back our carbon emissions. So this number is the biggest piece here. Everything else is relatively small and gives us very little information. And obviously this is something I cut out, but it's a little bit busy. My eyes don't know where to go in here for what to see. Does it make sense to have heat waves up here on the mountaintops? Does it make sense to have our crop failure right next to our forests? What makes sense, right? So this structure, I don't think, helps us understand what's going on. How does this communicate health impacts? Because of this ambulance? So be thinking about never making anything too busy unless you're trying to communicate some idea of chaos. Here again, we see a huge number right in the middle in high contrast to at least this part of the background, not so much this part. So 40% is the number I read, and I read 40% of the world's population because that's in the center. And then I'm like, oh, I don't understand what's happening. So I go up to the top. With 2.5 billion people worldwide relying on agriculture, 40% of the world's population will be severely affected by climate change. So I'm given no context here. Also, we have India, for whatever reason, they're highlighted in the middle. What is this trying to tell me? I know that 40% of people will be severely affected by climate change, and that has to do with our reliance on agriculture. I would need more information here. So in my opinion, even if this is part of a larger framework of information, this is kind of a waste of space. So size can also communicate relative quantities, right? So if we're talking about where is global warming going, here we have circles that represent the relative percent as far as their size for where that warming is going. So we can see that the ocean absorbs the vast majority of most of that warming, where the rest of it is distributed in these kind of increasingly small areas. So here's another one where we're looking at size for importance. For whatever reason, sea is bigger, right? So maybe they're talking about the sea getting bigger, so they make the word sea bigger. Maybe it would have been better to have rising and then sea and then levels. So an increasing height of those words. It's all up to you and your kind of design choices. And here we have 3 different projections. So this is the high estimate of what happens with our carbon. This is the best estimate, and this is our low estimate. And so we have a lot of information in this picture here. There is a little bit of information to situate us in the topic there. We see that Greenland becomes very important with this. We get 30% of the ocean's new water contribution coming from those Greenland ice sheets. And that leads to our sea level rise contribution by 2100, which at a low rate would be 3.5 inches, at a high rate is 19 inches. And notice that they put no difference between these number sizes, but they put a difference in color. And that bright pink is a little bit more alarming, whereas this light green is kind of, maybe it's more calming. Depends on your own personal psychology, but in general, people notice red as a color because we're animals, right? So that's part of our biology. So that's a little piece of information. Here we have another little piece of information. We get some kind of arrows to guide us around and tell us where to look. So 5 million people at risk. And then we have this other little piece of information here. So we have these kind of little puzzle pieces that all go together to communicate this big idea to us, that we have projected 2 feet of rising in our best estimate, but the potential to go up to 3.5 feet. One thing that would be interesting is to see kind of how that would impact everyone, right? We see where our most vulnerable states are, but we don't see the actual change in maybe like where the water would be, like goodbye Florida, goodbye maybe parts of California. So thinking about what is the most important information to communicate? Is it important to communicate that these 10 states are the most vulnerable, or would it be better to just show a map of the United States with that sea level rise? Or potentially it doesn't look like much, so maybe you would zoom in on Florida and show how much of Florida would go underwater if we were at this high estimate. Okay, so we talked about size. Bigger communicates many different things, most often importance. We can also think about position. So centrally located elements, things at the top, those are your two kind of positions of power. So people's eyes will go to the top and to the center of an image generally first. And then we tend to read, at least in our sort of Western culture, from the left to the right. Not all cultures do that, so it depends on who you're trying to communicate to. But assuming that you are, writing this in English, you're probably communicating with people who are going to be reading from left to right. So if I'm looking at this, I see the garbage can, but because that's kind of lighter in color, my eye kind of travels up to the top and I see, the food we waste. And then here, this apple has been kind of used as a pie chart, right, which is clever. Thinking about this third of UK vegetable crops are never harvested and are rejected by retailers due to minor aesthetic imperfections. So we're introducing food waste. What are the kind of data that communicate the issue to people? And we are using food to communicate about food. And then here, so we go to our eggs, and then my mind actually kind of reads kind of like this as I'm going through. So I have this sort of color palette that I'm following. Another thing you can think about with these colors is that red and yellow are sort of the McDonald's colors, and they're the McDonald's colors because they are associated with hunger, apparently. There's a lot of psychology that goes into advertising. So thinking about, position, but then all the other elements with that position. So we have our introduction to the issue with our kind of big data pieces on the top, and then we get increasingly smaller squares as we move down. I drew all over that. So central and top are both positions of importance. This brings us to another infographic. This communicates how the countries on our planet are arranged with respect to each other, but it communicates it from a very specific perspective. So the way that a map is arranged can often convey importance in sort of subtle ways. So if you think about our planet as a sphere, it doesn't look like this. It's not this flat rectangle. So changing it into a flat rectangle is going to increase the size of anything that's on the top or bottom and decrease the size of anything in the middle. So Africa looks significantly smaller than it actually is relative to these other countries. And everything in this top part, like Russia, Greenland, Canada, especially here, Scandinavia, these all look much larger than they actually are relative to other countries. And what is in the central middle position is the UK. So a lot of the maps that we see were made by either British people or British colonialists, right? Countries that were culturally then converted into British colonies. So you can imagine who might have made this map. Who is in the middle? You can't really change who's on top or not. Well, I guess you could. We can change who's on top by the northern and southern hemisphere, right? So there is importance given to the northern hemisphere because that's where England was or is. But this map could easily have the southern hemisphere on top. There's no reason why the northern hemisphere needs to be on top, other than that is a perceived position of importance. And who might have made this map? Here's America. Who are these people who are right in the middle and on top? I believe this map was made in Japan, but I can't remember. But they are these most centrally located and on the top. So an interesting, different culture kind of way of projecting our planet. And here we see Africa more on the size that it should be, as well as South America. South America gets very diminutive in our kind of layout of what the planet looks like. Anything equatorial. So you can also consider position in a way to juxtapose different ideas. And this is a juxtaposition where we have this bountiful side. We're showing food waste, right? We're looking at food, but we have this sort of cornucopia of food, and everything's very busy. And then over in hunger, it's all very bleak, and we have like bleak colors. And these are little Empire State Buildings that each represent some amount of people. I can't remember, but they look like rockets or bombs or syringes. They look like something terrible. And so you have this like positive and negative conveyed by position, but also by many other elements. So having two very dissimilar things right next to each other can often magnify what you're trying to say on each side because of that juxtaposition. This is a little bit of a sidebar on juxtaposition, but one of my favorite uses where we have knows if you've been naughty or nice, great power, great responsibility, and wears a red suit, and how all of those things interact with each other.